One cold evening, a poor woman opened her door to a silent traveler, tired, hungry, and too proud to ask for help. She offered him soup, a blanket, and a place by the fire, asking for nothing in return. He left at dawn without a word, just a quiet nod of thanks. Weeks later, a lawyer arrived at her door with a sealed letter, and her name written inside a will. The traveler she'd helped in silence had left her everything. The rain came down like judgment. It hammered the tin roof of the shack with a sound that swallowed thought, drowned memory, turned the world into nothing but water and darkness and the cold that crept through every crack in the wood. Clara Winton stood at the window, her breath fogging the glass, watching the plains dissolve into sheets of gray. The candle in her hand trembled, its flame bending sideways every time the wind found a gap in the walls. She'd lived through storms before, 23 winters in this valley, each one harder than the last, but tonight felt different. Tonight, the rain sounded angry. She turned back toward the hearth, where the fire had burned down to embers, and reached for another log from the nearly empty pile beside the stone. Her hands were rough, the knuckles swollen from years of washing, scrubbing, mending, the kind of hands that told a story without words. She fed the fire slowly, carefully, the way you do when wood is scarce and winter isn't finished with you yet. That's when she heard it, a sound beneath the rain, faint, almost nothing. But there, a thud against the door. Clara froze, the poker still in her hand, her heart suddenly loud in her chest. She looked toward the door, then back at the fire, then at the door again. No one came out here, not anymore, not since her husband died 3 years ago and the neighbors stopped checking in. She was too poor to rob, too old to bother with. The world had moved on and left her in this shack with a leaking roof and a garden that barely grew. Another thud, heavier this time. She set the poker down and crossed the room, her bare feet silent on the cold wood. Her hand hovered over the latch. She could feel the wind pressing against the door from the other side, rattling the frame. Her pulse hammered in her ears. "Who's there?" she called, her voice thin against the roar of the storm. No answer, just the rain, just the wind. She pressed her ear to the door, listening, and then she heard it, a low, ragged sound, not quite a groan, not quite a breath, something in between. Clara's hand moved to the latch. She hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to leave it shut, to go back to the fire, to pretend she'd heard nothing. But something else tugged at her, something older than fear. She opened the door. The wind hit her like a fist, driving rain into her face, soaking her dress in seconds. She squinted into the darkness, and there, collapsed against the doorframe, was a man. He was on his knees, one hand braced against the wood, his head bowed. His coat was torn and plastered to his body, his hair hanging in dark, wet strands over his face. He didn't look up, didn't speak, just knelt there in the mud, shaking. "God in heaven," Clara whispered. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his shoulders, unsure where to touch, how to help. His skin was cold, too cold. She could see his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. "Can you hear me?" she asked, leaning closer. "Can you stand?" He didn't answer, didn't even lift his head. Clara looked out into the night, toward the road that disappeared into darkness and rain. No horse, no wagon, nothing. Just this man, alone, barely alive. She made a decision. She slipped her arm under his shoulder and pulled, grunting with the effort. He was heavy, all dead weight, but she managed to get him upright enough to drag him inside. His boots scraped across the threshold, leaving streaks of mud on the floor. She kicked the door shut behind them and lowered him onto the rug in front of the fire. For a moment she just stood there, breathing hard, staring down at him. The firelight played across his face, pale, gaunt, streaked with dirt and rain. His eyes were closed, his lips cracked and colorless. She couldn't tell how old he was. 30, maybe older. His face had the look of someone who'd seen too much and said too little. Clara knelt beside him and began pulling at his coat, peeling the soaked fabric away from his body. Beneath it, his shirt was torn, and she could see bruises along his ribs, dark purple and yellow. Old injuries, new ones. She didn't know, didn't matter. She grabbed a blanket from the chair by the hearth and wrapped it around his shoulders, then moved to stoke the fire higher. The flames caught, hissing as the new wood began to burn. She filled a tin cup with water from the bucket by the door and brought it back, tilting his head gently and pressing the rim to his lips. "Drink," she whispered. He didn't respond at first. Then slowly his throat moved. A swallow, then another. His eyes flickered open for just a second, dark, unfocused, and then closed again. Clara sat back on her heels watching him. Her heart was still racing, but the fear was fading now, replaced by something quieter. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. She didn't know who he was. Didn't know where he'd come from or what had brought him to her door. But he was here. And he was alive. And that was enough. Outside, the storm howled like a wounded animal, clawing at the walls, rattling the windows. But inside, the fire crackled softly, and the rain became distant, muffled. Clara pulled a chair close to the hearth and sat down, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes on the stranger. She would keep watch. She would keep him warm. She would do what needed to be done, because that's what you did. When someone collapsed at your door in the rain, you didn't turn them away. You didn't ask questions. You just helped, even if you had nothing. Even if they were a stranger, even if the world had forgotten you. The night stretched on, long and slow. Clara dozed in the chair, waking every few minutes to check on him, to add another log to the fire, to make sure he was still breathing. His chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm now, the color beginning to return to his face. She draped another blanket over him, tucking it around his shoulders. At some point she noticed his hand. It was lying on the floor beside him, fingers curled slightly, and there was something in his palm. She leaned closer, squinting in the firelight. A piece of paper, folded, damp and wrinkled. She hesitated, then gently pried it from his hand. It was a note, written in careful, faded ink. Most of the words had blurred from the rain, but she could make out a few fragments. No longer who I was, seeking something worth. Forgive. Clara stared at the note for a long time, then carefully folded it again and set it on the table. She didn't know what it meant, didn't know if it was a confession or a prayer or something in between, but she knew pain when she saw it, and this man, whoever he was, carried it like a stone. Dawn came slow and hesitant, the rain easing to a steady drizzle. The storm's fury had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and gray. Clara stood by the window, watching the mist roll across the valley, her hands wrapped around a cup of weak tea. Behind her, the man stirred. She turned, setting the cup down, and crossed the room. He was awake now, his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. He didn't move, didn't speak. Just lay there, breathing. "You're safe," Clara said softly, kneeling beside him. "You're in my home. You collapsed outside last night." He blinked slowly, his gaze shifting toward her. For a moment, they just looked at each other, two strangers caught in the quiet after the storm. Then he closed his eyes again, and his lips moved, forming a single word. "Thank you." His voice was rough, barely more than a whisper, but it was enough. Clara nodded, though he couldn't see it. She reached for the cup of water and held it out to him. "Drink," she said again. This time he did, slowly, carefully. His hand shook as he took the cup from her, and she steadied it, guiding it to his lips. He drank until it was empty, then handed it back to her with a faint nod. "What's your name?" Clara asked. He didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted toward the fire, then back to her. When he finally spoke, his voice was even quieter than before. "Eli, just that, nothing more." Clara waited, expecting him to say something else, where he was from, why he was out in the storm, what had brought him to her door. But he didn't. He just closed his eyes again, his breathing slowing. She stood, picking up the empty cup, and looked down at him. He was asleep again, or close to it. His face was still pale, but the shaking had stopped. He would live. She walked back to the window and stared out at the valley. The rain had left puddles in the dirt road, and the sky was beginning to lighten in the east, turning from gray to pale gold. She didn't know who Eli was, didn't know what secrets he carried, or what had broken him enough to collapse at her door in the middle of the night. But she knew this much. He was here now, and as long as he was under her roof, she would keep him safe, even if the world outside didn't care, even if no one ever knew, because mercy wasn't something you gave expecting anything back. It was something you gave because it was right. The morning unfolded quiet and careful. Clara moved through the small space with practiced efficiency, rationing what little she had, a handful of oats, a bit of lard, some dried herbs from the summer garden. She made a thin broth and set it warming over the fire, the scent filling the cabin. Eli didn't wake again until midday. When he did, he pushed himself up slowly, wincing, one hand pressed to his ribs. Clara was at the table, mending a torn shirt by the light from the window. She looked up when she heard him move. "Easy," she said, setting the needle down. "You're still hurt." He nodded but didn't speak. His eyes moved around the cabin, taking in the bare walls, the sagging ceiling, the pile of split wood by the door. His gaze lingered on the small table, the single chair, the empty hooks where coats should have hung. Clara saw him looking and felt a flush of shame rise in her chest. She wasn't used to visitors, wasn't used to anyone seeing how little she had. "It's not much," she said quietly, picking up the needle again. "But it's warm." Eli's gaze shifted to her. For a long moment, he just looked at her, really looked, and she felt something in his expression that she couldn't name. Not pity, not judgment. Gratitude, maybe, or something deeper. "It's more than I deserve," he said. His voice was steadier now, though still rough. Clara met his eyes and saw something there that made her chest tighten. Pain, not the kind that came from bruises or broken ribs, the kind that lived deeper. "You were dying," Clara said simply. "I couldn't leave you outside." Eli nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. He was silent for a long time, and Clara returned to her mending, letting the quiet settle between them. After a while he spoke again. "I'll leave as soon as I can walk." Clara didn't look up. She just pulled the thread through the fabric, her hands steady. "No rush," she said, and she meant it. The hours passed. Eli drank the broth she offered him, ate a small piece of bread, and fell asleep again by the fire. Clara watched him for a while, then pulled on her shawl and stepped outside. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with mist. The valley stretched out before her, gray and still, the hills fading into shadow. She stood on the porch, her arms crossed, and breathed in the cold. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, didn't know if Eli would leave or stay, or if she'd wake up to find him gone without a word. But for now, he was here, and for now, that was enough. Inside, the fire crackled softly. Eli lay wrapped in blankets, his breathing deep and even. On the table, the folded note still sat, its ink blurred and fading. And outside, the world began to soften. The mist lifted. The sky lightened. And somewhere beyond the valley, the sun broke through the clouds, casting long golden beams across the rain-soaked earth. But when the sun rose over the drenched valley, it found two souls too cautious to speak, and too human to walk away. The morning after the storm, the world smelled like wet earth and new grass. Clara woke before dawn, as she always did, her body trained by years of rising when the sky was still dark. She lay still for a moment, listening. The cabin was quiet, except for the faint crackle of embers in the hearth. Then she remembered, the traveler. She sat up slowly, her joints stiff from sleeping in the chair, and looked toward the fire. Eli was still there, lying on his side now, one arm tucked under his head. His chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, alive, healing. Clara stood, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders, and padded across the room to the door. She eased it open and stepped outside. The valley was draped in mist, soft and thick, rolling down from the hills like water. The air was cold and damp, and she could hear the distant trickle of the creek, swollen from the rain. Everything looked scrubbed, clean, the colors brighter, sharper. The mud from yesterday had settled into dark, slick patches along the road. She walked to the small garden beside the cabin, her bare feet sinking into the soft ground. Most of the plants had been battered by the storm. Tomato vines flattened, bean poles toppled. She knelt and began pulling them upright, tying them back to their stakes with strips of cloth she kept in her apron pocket. Behind her, the door creaked. She looked over her shoulder. Eli stood in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame, his face pale but alert. He was wearing the blanket around his shoulders like a cloak. "You should be resting," Clara said, turning back to the garden. "I've rested enough." His voice was quiet but firm. Clara didn't argue. She finished tying off the last vine and stood, brushing the dirt from her hands. "You hungry?" she asked. He nodded. "Come inside, then." She made cornmeal mush with a little butter and salt, stretching what she had to feed two instead of one. Eli sat at the table watching her work. He didn't speak, but his eyes followed her movements, the way she stirred the pot, the way she wiped the counter with a rag worn thin from use. When the food was ready, she set a bowl in front of him and took the other for herself. They ate in silence, the only sound the scrape of spoons against tin. Clara could feel him watching her between bites, and she wondered what he saw. A woman past her prime, she figured. Worn down, poor, nothing special. But when she glanced up, his expression wasn't one of pity or judgment. It was something else, something quieter. Respect, maybe. When they finished, Eli pushed his bowl away and folded his hands on the table. "I can work," he said. Clara looked at him, surprised. "You're still hurt." "I can work," he said again, more firmly this time. "You gave me shelter, food. I owe you. You don't owe me anything." "I do." There was a weight in his voice that made her pause. She studied his face, the sharp lines of his jaw, the dark shadows under his eyes, the way he held himself, like a man carrying something too heavy to name. "You're not well enough," she said gently. "Then tell me what needs doing," he replied, "and I'll do what I can." Clara hesitated, then sighed. She could see he wasn't going to let this go. "The roof leaks," she said finally, "over the back corner. The fence by the garden is half rotted through." Eli nodded. "I'll start with the fence." He worked slowly at first, his movements stiff and deliberate. Clara watched from the garden, pulling weeds and resetting stakes, glancing over every few minutes to make sure he wasn't pushing himself too hard. But Eli was careful. He measured twice, cut once, tested every post before hammering it in. By midday, he'd replaced 3 sections of fence. Clara brought him water, and he drank it without a word, then went back to work. She didn't ask questions, didn't press him for his story. Whatever had brought him here, whatever he was running from or toward, it wasn't her business, not yet. But she noticed things. The way he avoided looking at the road, the way his hands shook when he thought she wasn't watching, the way he flinched at sudden sounds, a bird taking flight, a distant dog barking. This was a man who'd learned to be careful, a man who'd learned not to trust. That evening, as the sun sank low and painted the valley in shades of gold and rose, Clara stood on the porch and watched Eli finish the last section of fence. He stepped back, testing the posts one more time, then nodded to himself, satisfied. He walked back toward the cabin, his coat streaked with dirt, his hair damp with sweat. When he reached the porch, he looked up at her, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he almost smiled. "It'll hold," he said. "Thank you," Clara replied. He nodded and moved past her into the cabin. She heard him pour water into the basin and splash his face, heard the quiet rustle of him settling by the fire. She stayed outside a little longer, watching the last of the light fade from the sky. The mist was rising again, curling up from the ground like breath. She thought about the man inside, about the way he worked without complaint, without expectation, about the way he looked at her, not like she was poor or broken, but like she was someone worth knowing. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at her like that. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Eli woke early, before Clara most mornings, and set about fixing things. The leaking roof, the wobbly leg on the table, the door that stuck in its frame. He worked quietly, methodically, never asking for thanks, never expecting praise. Clara cooked what little she had and stretched it as far as it would go. Oats in the morning, beans and cornbread at midday, soup in the evening, thin but warm. She watched him eat, noticed how he always left a little in his bowl, as if he were trying not to take too much. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of small things, glances, nods, the quiet understanding that came from working side by side. At night, Clara would sit by the fire and mend clothes while Eli carved scraps of wood he found in the yard. She didn't know what he was making at first. Then one evening, he set something on the table in front of her. A ladle, simple, smooth, beautiful. "For the soup pot," he said. Clara picked it up, turning it over in her hands. The wood was warm, the handle worn smooth by his knife. She looked up at him, and her throat tightened. "It's lovely," she whispered. Eli nodded and looked away, his jaw tight. She set the ladle down carefully and went back to her mending, but her hands were shaking. The neighbors began to talk. Mrs. Harding from down the road stopped by one afternoon, her sharp eyes taking in the repaired fence, the patched roof, the stranger splitting wood by the barn. "Who's that?" she asked, her tone clipped. "A traveler," Clara said. "He was hurt. I'm helping him until he's well." Mrs. Harding's lips pursed. "Silent men carry louder pasts, Clara." "Maybe so," Clara replied, "but loud men carry louder lies." Mrs. Harding huffed and left without another word. That evening, Clara told Eli what she'd said. He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his eyes. "She's not wrong," he said quietly. "I don't care," Clara replied, and she didn't. One morning, Clara woke to find Eli already outside, crouched by the garden. She pulled her shawl on and stepped into the cool morning air. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Planting," he said, not looking up. She came closer and saw he'd turned over a new section of soil, neat rows already marked out with string. "Where did you learn to do that?" she asked. "My father," Eli said. He pressed a seed into the dirt and covered it gently. "He used to say you plant by the moon's pull, start when it's waxing, harvest when it's waning." Clara knelt beside him. "He sounds like a wise man." Eli's hands stilled. He didn't answer. Clara didn't push. She just picked up a handful of seeds and began planting beside him. Spring began to soften the valley. The hills turned green, the wildflowers bloomed, and the birds returned, filling the mornings with song. Clara's cabin, once so quiet and lonely, felt full now, full of sound, full of warmth, full of life. She caught herself humming while she cooked, smiling when Eli came in from the fields, waiting by the window for him to finish his work so they could sit by the fire together. It scared her. Because she'd been alone for so long, she'd forgotten what it felt like to need someone, and she was starting to need him. One evening, Clara fell ill. A fever came on sudden and fierce, leaving her weak and shaking. She tried to hide it, tried to keep working, but her legs gave out halfway to the hearth. Eli caught her before she hit the floor. "Easy," he said, his voice low and steady. He lifted her, gently, carefully, and carried her to the bed in the corner. "I'm fine," Clara protested, but her voice was faint. "You're not," Eli said. He brought her water, stoked the fire, made broth and left it by her bedside. When she woke in the night, burning with fever, he was there, pressing a cool cloth to her forehead. "Sleep," he whispered. "I'm here." And she did. 2 days later, the fever broke. Clara woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of something cooking. She sat up slowly, her body weak but no longer aching. Eli was asleep in the chair by the hearth, his head tipped back, his arms crossed over his chest. Clara stared at him for a long time, at the stubble on his jaw, the lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders rose and fell with each breath. This man, this stranger, had stayed. He could have left, should have left, but he'd stayed. And for the first time in years, Clara's house felt like a home. But peace never lingers long where secrets still breathe. The creek ran clear and cold, rushing over smooth stones worn down by 100 seasons. Clara knelt at its edge, her skirt tucked under her knees, scrubbing a shirt against a flat rock. The water numbed her hands, but she didn't mind. The sun was warm on her back, and the air smelled like pine and new grass. Upstream, Eli worked on the old barn, replacing boards that had rotted through the winter. She could hear the steady rhythm of his hammer, the sound carrying across the meadow in clear, even beats. It had become familiar now, that sound, as familiar as her own heartbeat. 6 weeks had passed since the storm, 6 weeks since he'd collapsed at her door, more dead than alive. Now he moved through her days like he'd always been there, fixing what was broken, building what was needed, asking nothing in return. Clara lifted the shirt from the water and wrung it out, watching the droplets fall back into the creek. Her hands were red from the cold, but they were steady, stronger than they'd been in years. Everything felt stronger now. She draped the shirt over a branch to dry and reached for the next piece of laundry. As she did, she caught movement from the corner of her eye. Eli was walking toward her, carrying something in his hands. She stood, brushing the dirt from her skirt, and waited. When he reached her, he held out what he'd been carrying, a wooden bucket, new, clean. The handle carved smooth, the joints fitted perfectly. "Your old one's cracked," he said simply. Clara took it, running her fingers over the wood. It was beautiful work, careful work, the kind that took time and patience. "Eli," she said softly, "you didn't have to." "I know." She looked up at him. His face was still guarded, still careful, but there was something different in his eyes now, something lighter. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and turned back toward the barn, but before he'd taken 3 steps, Clara called after him. "Eli?" He stopped, looked back. "It's beautiful." For just a moment his expression softened, then he nodded again and walked away. Clara watched him go, the bucket still in her hands, and felt something warm unfold in her chest. The days grew longer as spring deepened into early summer. The garden flourished under Eli's careful tending, rows of beans climbing their poles, tomatoes ripening on the vine, squash spreading their broad leaves across the ground. Clara had never seen her small patch of earth produce so much. She taught him her late husband's methods, the way to tell when corn was ready by the feel of the silk, the way to save seeds from the best plants for next year, the way to read the sky for rain. Eli listened, learned, remembered, and slowly, carefully, he began to teach her things too. How to sharpen a blade so it held its edge, how to mix ash and water to make lye soap, how to read the wind to know when weather was coming. He never said where he'd learned these things, never spoke of his life before, but Clara could see it in the way he worked, the precision, the knowledge, the quiet competence of someone who'd been taught well and remembered everything. They fell into an easy partnership. Clara would cook while Eli worked the garden. He would carry water while she hung laundry. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch and watch the sun sink behind the hills, not talking, just being. It was the most peaceful Clara had felt in years, maybe ever. One afternoon, they walked down to the creek together to check the fishing lines Eli had set that morning. The path was overgrown with ferns and wild violets, and Clara had to lift her skirt to keep it from catching on the brambles. Eli walked ahead, pushing branches aside, holding them until she passed. She noticed these small courtesies now, the way he always let her through a door first, the way he carried the heavy things without being asked, the way he never took more than his share at meals. At the creek, they found 3 fat trout on the lines. Eli cleaned them quickly, expertly, while Clara gathered wild onions and herbs from the bank. They would have a good supper tonight. As they walked back, Clara glanced over at him. He was carrying the fish in one hand, his other swinging loose at his side. His sleeves were rolled up, showing forearms tanned by the sun. He looked healthier now, stronger. The hollow look had left his face. "You're good at this," Clara said. "At what?" "All of it. Building, planting, fishing. Did someone teach you?" Eli was quiet for a long moment. Clara thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, quietly, "My father. Before he died." "I'm sorry," Clara said. Eli nodded but didn't say more. Clara let the silence settle between them. She'd learned by now that Eli's silences weren't walls. They were just pauses, places where words couldn't reach what he was feeling. When they got back to the cabin, Eli built up the fire while Clara prepared the fish. She wrapped them in wet leaves with the onions and herbs and set them on the coals to cook. The smell filled the small space, rich, savory, alive. They ate on the porch as the light turned gold. Clara had never tasted anything so good. The neighbors still talked, of course. Mrs. Harding spread her suspicions like seeds, and they took root quickly. A strange man living with a widow woman. No ring, no kin. What kind of arrangement was that? But Clara didn't care. Let them talk, she thought. Let them judge. They didn't know what it was like to be alone for so long that you forgot what your own voice sounded like. They didn't know what it was like to wake up every morning with nothing but work and silence and the slow march toward winter. They didn't know what it was like to be seen. And Eli saw her, not as poor Clara Winton, the widow with the leaking roof and the empty cupboards. Not as the woman people pitied or ignored. He saw her as someone worth staying for. One evening, as Clara was sweeping the porch, she noticed Eli sitting on the fence by the garden, carving something. She set the broom aside and walked over. "What are you making?" she asked. He looked up, then held out his hand. In his palm was a small bird, carved from a piece of cedar. It was delicate, detailed, every feather visible, the wings spread as if caught mid-flight. Clara took it carefully, turning it over in her fingers. "It's beautiful." "It's for you," Eli said, "for the windowsill." She looked at him, her throat tight. "Why?" He shrugged, looking away. "You said you missed the birds in winter. Now you'll have one year round." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. She closed her hand around the little bird and nodded, not trusting her voice. That night, she set it on the windowsill above the basin, where the morning light would catch it, and every time she looked at it, she felt that warmth again, the feeling that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone anymore. The season turned, slow and steady. The long light of summer settled over the valley, bringing warmth and growth, and the hum of cicadas in the evening. Clara's garden overflowed. She pickled beans, dried herbs, stored away what they couldn't eat fresh. Eli rebuilt the chicken coop, and Clara traded eggs with the neighbors for flour and sugar. She baked bread for the first time in months. Real bread, not the hard flat cake she'd been making, and Eli ate it with butter and honey, his eyes closed, savoring every bite. "This," he said quietly, "is the best thing I've ever tasted." Clara laughed. "It's just bread." "No," Eli said, opening his eyes. "It's not." And the way he looked at her then, steady, grateful, something deeper, made her look away, her cheeks flushing. One afternoon they worked side by side in the garden, pulling weeds and thinning the carrot rows. The sun was hot, and Clara had tied a cloth around her head to keep the sweat from her eyes. Eli worked without a shirt, his skin brown from the sun, his movements easy and practiced. Clara found herself watching him more than she should. The way his shoulders moved, the way he wiped his brow with the back of his hand, the way he paused sometimes, looking out at the hills as if searching for something he couldn't name. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked before she could stop herself. Eli's hands stilled. He didn't look at her. "Sometimes." Clara's chest tightened. "Why don't you?" He was quiet for a long time. Then softly, "Because I don't have anywhere else to go." She wanted to ask more, wanted to know where he'd come from, what he was running from, why a man like him, skilled, strong, clearly educated, was living in a shack with a poor widow in the middle of nowhere. But she didn't, because she was afraid of the answer, afraid that if she pushed too hard he'd disappear like smoke. That night, a storm rolled in, not like the one that had brought Eli, but gentler. A summer storm, full of thunder and lightning but passing quickly. They sat by the fire and listened to the rain drum against the roof, now patched and solid thanks to Eli's work. Clara mended a pair of his trousers while he carved another small figure, a rabbit this time, sitting on its haunches, ears alert. "You're good at that," Clara said, nodding toward the carving. Eli shrugged. "It helps me think. What do you think about?" He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. Then quietly, "What comes next?" Clara set down her needle. "And what do you think comes next?" Eli didn't answer right away. He turned the rabbit over in his hands, testing the smoothness of the wood. Outside, the thunder rumbled, distant now. "I don't know," he said finally. "I used to think I did, used to have plans, a future." He paused. "But that was a long time ago. What changed?" Clara asked softly. Eli's jaw tightened. "I did." He set the rabbit on the table and stood, walking to the window. He stared out at the rain, his hands braced on the sill. Clara watched him, her heart aching. She wanted to go to him, wanted to put her hand on his shoulder, tell him that whatever he'd lost, whatever he was running from, it didn't matter here. But she didn't. Because some distances you can't cross with touch, some distances only time can close. The storm passed, leaving the air cool and fresh. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the world washed clean. Clara woke to find Eli already outside, working on something by the barn. She dressed and went out carrying 2 cups of coffee, weak but hot. She handed one to him, and he took it with a nod of thanks. "What are you building?" she asked. "A bench," he said, "for the porch, so you don't have to stand when you watch the sunset." Clara felt that warmth again spreading through her chest. "You don't have to do that. I know." She smiled and sipped her coffee, watching him work. His hands were steady, confident, every cut precise, every joint perfect. "Where did you learn carpentry?" she asked. Eli paused, then resumed his work. "My father taught me," said a man who could build. "Something was worth more than a man who could only talk." "He sounds like a wise man." "He was," Eli said quietly, "until he wasn't." Clara wanted to ask what he meant, but before she could, Eli set down his tools and straightened, looking at her. "Clara," he said, his voice serious, "why did you help me? That night, you didn't know me, didn't owe me anything. Why?" Clara looked down at her cup. The steam rose in lazy curls, disappearing into the morning air. "Because," she said softly, "I know what it's like to be left outside in the cold." Eli studied her face for a long moment. Then he nodded, as if she'd answered a question he'd been carrying for weeks. They didn't speak after that. Just stood together in the quiet morning, drinking their coffee, watching the light spread across the valley. As the days passed, something shifted between them. Not in words. Words weren't enough for what they were becoming to each other, but in the small things. The way Eli always saved her the best piece of meat at supper, the way Clara mended his clothes before her own, the way their hands would brush when passing a tool or a dish and neither would pull away. Clara caught herself thinking about him at odd moments, while kneading bread, while hanging laundry, while lying in bed at night. She wondered what he was thinking, what he was feeling, if he ever looked at her and saw anything more than a kind woman who'd taken him in. She was afraid to hope, because hope was dangerous when you had nothing. One evening, as they sat on the new bench Eli had built, watching the sun sink behind the hills, Clara felt his hand move closer to hers. Not touching, just there. Close enough that she could feel the warmth of it. Her heart hammered in her chest. She didn't move, didn't breathe. And then, so gently she almost didn't feel it, his fingers brushed hers. Clara closed her eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, she felt something other than loneliness. She felt alive. But as the sun dropped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and ash, a shadow crossed Eli's face. Clara saw it. The way his jaw tightened, the way his hand pulled back, the way he stood abruptly and walked to the edge of the porch. "Eli?" she said. He didn't turn, just stood there, staring out at the darkening valley. "I can't stay forever," he said quietly. Clara's chest went cold. "Why not?" "Because," he trailed off, shook his head. "Because men like me don't get to keep good things." "That's not true," Clara said, standing. "Eli, whatever you think you are, whatever you've done, you don't know what I've done," he said, his voice sharp. Then softer, "You don't know who I am. Then tell me." Eli turned to face her. In the fading light, his eyes looked dark, haunted. "I can't," he whispered. Clara stepped closer. "Why?" "Because if I do," Eli said, "you'll ask me to leave." They stood there, just feet apart, the space between them thick with everything unsaid. Clara wanted to close the distance, wanted to tell him that nothing he could say would make her turn him away, but the fear in his eyes stopped her. Because she realized then that Eli wasn't just running from something, he was running from himself. That night, Clara lay awake in the dark, listening to the sound of Eli's breathing by the fire. The bench he'd built still sat on the porch, solid and strong. The garden he'd tended still flourished. The roof he'd mended still held. Everything he touched he made better, except himself. Clara closed her eyes and whispered a prayer into the darkness. "Let him stay, please. Let him stay." But even as she prayed, she felt the future shifting. Like a storm building on the horizon, too far to see but close enough to feel. And as spring touched the valley, the silence between them began to warm, like coals under old ashes. But peace never lingers long where secrets still breathe. The sky was clear the day the rider came. Clara was in the garden, her hands deep in the soil, pulling weeds from around the tomato plants. The sun was high and hot, and sweat trickled down her back, but she didn't mind. The work felt good, honest, the kind of labor that cleared the mind and settled the heart. Eli was at the creek, checking the fishing lines. She could hear him moving through the brush, the snap of twigs, the splash of water. He'd be back soon with whatever they'd caught, and she'd fry it up with the last of the cornmeal. Everything felt ordinary. Safe. Then she heard it, the sound of hoofbeats on the road. Clara straightened, shading her eyes with one hand. A rider was coming up the long dirt path toward the cabin, moving at an easy pace. As he drew closer, she could make out details: a dark coat, well-tailored, a flat-brimmed hat, a horse that looked too fine for these parts. Her stomach tightened. Visitors were rare out here, and the kind who rode horses like that were usually bringing trouble. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward the cabin. By the time the rider reached the yard, she was standing on the porch, arms crossed, waiting. The man pulled his horse to a stop and tipped his hat. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 40, with a clean-shaven face and sharp eyes that took in everything at once. The cabin, the garden, the repaired fence, her. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, his voice smooth and polite. "Name's Marshall Denton. I'm looking for someone, and I was hoping you might be able to help." Clara's pulse quickened, but she kept her face neutral. "I don't know many people, Marshall." "I understand." He dismounted, moving with the easy confidence of a man who is used to getting answers. "I'm looking for a man. Mid-30s, tall, dark hair, might be traveling alone, might be injured." Clara's throat went dry. "Why are you looking for him?" "He's wanted for questioning," Denton said, "in connection with a matter down in the territories. Nothing violent, ma'am, I assure you, but important nonetheless." "What kind of matter?" Denton smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. the kind that's best handled quietly. Has anyone matching that description come through here? Clara hesitated. Every instinct told her to lie to protect Eli, to send this man away. But she'd never been good at lying, and something about Marshall Denton made her think he'd see right through her. There was a traveler, she said slowly. Came through after the storm about 6 weeks back. Stayed a few days while he healed up, then moved on. Denton's eyes narrowed. Where'd he go? Didn't say. Just left one morning. The marshal studied her face for a long moment. Clara forced herself to meet his gaze, to keep her breathing steady. Mind if I look around? Denton asked. I do, actually, Clara said. You got no right to search my property without cause. No, ma'am, I don't. Denton smiled again, that same cold smile. But I'd consider it a kindness, and I'd remember it. It wasn't a threat. Not exactly. But Clara heard the weight behind the words. Before she could answer, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned and saw Eli coming up from the creek, a string of fish in one hand. He stopped when he saw the marshal, his whole body going still. For a moment, nobody moved. Denton's eyes locked onto Eli, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or satisfaction. Well now, Denton said quietly. Looks like somebody didn't move on after all. Eli set the fish down carefully on the porch railing. His face was blank, but Clara could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands hung loose at his sides, ready. Marshal, Eli said, his voice flat. Mr. Thorne, Denton tipped his hat. Or should I say Mr. Elias Thorne? Of the Boston Thorns? Clara's breath caught. She looked at Eli, but he didn't take his eyes off Denton. That name doesn't mean anything out here, Eli said. Maybe not to some folks, Denton replied, but it means plenty back east, especially to the lawyers settling your father's estate. They've been looking for you for over a year. Clara felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Estate, Boston, lawyers, Eli. Her Eli, who mended fences and planted gardens and carved birds from cedar, was someone else entirely. I gave up my claim, Eli said. I signed the papers. You did, Denton agreed. But there are complications, questions about the circumstances. Your uncle's petition to contest the will, the missing funds. He paused. You disappeared at a very convenient time, Mr. Thorne. I didn't take anything that wasn't mine. Maybe so. But running makes a man look guilty. I wasn't running, Eli said. I was leaving. What's the difference? Eli didn't answer. Denton sighed and pulled a folded paper from his coat. I'm not here to arrest you. Just to serve you this summons. You're required to appear in Boston within 60 days to give testimony regarding the estate. If you don't show, there'll be a warrant. He held out the paper. Eli didn't take it. I'm not going back, Eli said. Then you'll be a fugitive, Denton replied. And next time someone comes looking for you, it won't be to talk. He stepped forward and tucked the paper into Eli's shirt pocket. Then he turned to Clara. Ma'am, I apologize for the intrusion, but I'd advise you to be careful about who you offer shelter to. A man who runs once will run again. He mounted his horse and tipped his hat one more time. 60 days, Mr. Thorne. After that, it's out of my hands. He turned his horse and rode back down the path, slow and unhurried, leaving a trail of dust in his wake. Clara and Eli stood in silence, watching until the marshal disappeared over the ridge. Then Clara turned to him. Boston? She said, her voice shaking. Your name is Elias Thorne? Eli closed his eyes. Clara, what else did you lie about? I didn't lie, Eli said, opening his eyes. I just didn't tell you. That's the same thing. No, Eli said quietly. It's not. Clara stepped back, her arms wrapping around herself. She felt cold despite the heat. Who are you? Eli looked away, his jaw tight. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, finally, I'm the son of a man who built an empire on the backs of people he didn't care about. I'm the heir to a fortune I never wanted. I'm the one who walked away from all of it because I couldn't stand what I'd become. He looked at her. And I'm the fool who thought he could start over. Why didn't you tell me? Because I wanted to be Eli, he said, his voice breaking. Just Eli. Elias Thorne, not the heir, not the disappointment. Just a man who could fix things, who could be useful, who could be enough. Clara felt tears sting her eyes. You've always been enough. No, Eli said. I haven't. He pulled the summons from his pocket and stared at it. I have to leave. You heard the marshal. If you don't go, I meant I have to leave here, Eli said, looking up at her. I have to leave you. Clara's chest constricted. Why? Because I can't drag you into this, Eli said. My uncle is a powerful man, ruthless. If he thinks you're connected to me, if he thinks you know something, he'll come after you. Let him, Clara said fiercely. I'm not afraid. You should be, Eli replied. I am. He stepped closer, and for a moment Clara thought he might reach for her. But he stopped, his hands clenched at his sides. You gave me something I didn't deserve, he said quietly. A place, a purpose, a reason to wake up in the morning. I won't repay that by bringing danger to your door. So you'll just leave? Clara's voice cracked. You'll just walk away like none of this mattered? It mattered, Eli said, his eyes shining. It mattered more than anything. He turned and walked into the cabin. Clara stood frozen on the porch, her hands shaking, her mind spinning. This couldn't be happening, not now, not after everything. Inside, Eli gathered his few possessions, his coat, his knife, the worn boots he'd arrived in. Clara followed him, watching as he moved through the small space like a ghost, touching nothing, leaving nothing behind. Where will you go? She asked. Doesn't matter. Eli. I'm sorry, he said, stopping at the door. He looked at her, and the pain in his eyes nearly broke her. I'm sorry I wasn't honest. I'm sorry I made you care. I'm sorry for all of it. Don't apologize for that, Clara whispered. Don't you dare apologize for that. Eli's throat worked. He looked like he wanted to say something else, but instead he just nodded and walked out. Clara followed him to the porch. He didn't have a horse, didn't have supplies. He was just going to walk away, the same way he'd arrived. You'll die out there, Clara said. You've got no food, no water. I've survived worse. Not alone. Eli stopped, turned back. I've always been alone, Clara. This was just a break from that. He started walking. Clara watched him go, her vision blurred with tears. He was halfway to the road when she found her voice. I don't care, she shouted. Eli stopped but didn't turn around. I don't care about your name or your money or your past, Clara said, her voice shaking. I don't care what you did or who you were. I only care about who you are now, and right now, you're a coward. Eli's shoulders tensed. You say you left Boston because you couldn't stand what you'd become, Clara continued, but you're doing the same thing here, running away when things get hard, deciding for me what I can and can't handle. That's not protection, Eli. That's just fear. Eli turned slowly. His face was stricken, his eyes red. I'm trying to keep you safe, he said. I don't need you to keep me safe, Clara replied. I need you to trust me, to let me decide what I'm willing to risk. They stared at each other across the yard. The sun beat down, relentless and bright. Somewhere in the distance a crow called. I can't, Eli said finally, his voice barely audible. I can't watch you get hurt because of me. And then he turned and walked away. Clara stood on the porch, her hands gripping the railing, watching him disappear down the road. She wanted to run after him, wanted to drag him back, wanted to shake him until he understood that she'd rather face danger with him than safety without him. But she didn't, because some things you can't force. Some things a person has to choose for themselves. The sun moved across the sky. The shadows lengthened. Clara stood on the porch until her legs ached and her eyes burned from the tears she refused to shed. Finally, as dusk began to settle over the valley, she went inside. The cabin felt empty, hollow. All the small traces of Eli's presence seemed to mock her. The bench he'd built, the ladle he'd carved, the mended fence visible through the window. Clara sank into the chair by the hearth and stared at the cold ashes. She'd been alone before. She could be alone again. But God, it hurt. It hurt in a way she hadn't known was possible. That night she lay in bed and listened to the silence. The cabin creaked. The wind whispered. And somewhere out in the darkness, Eli was walking alone. She thought about the letter she'd found that first night. The one that had fallen from his pocket, its ink smudged and fading, no longer who I was, seeking something worth, forgive. Now she understood. Eli hadn't been seeking redemption. He'd been seeking permission to believe he deserved it, and she'd given him that, for a little while. But it hadn't been enough. The next morning, Clara woke to an empty house and a silent yard. She went through the motions, made coffee, tended the garden, fed the chickens, but everything felt hollow. Mrs. Harding came by in the afternoon, her eyes sharp with curiosity. I heard a marshal came through yesterday, she said, looking for your traveler. He found him, Clara said flatly. And he's gone. Mrs. Harding pursed her lips. Well, I suppose that's for the best. Man like that was bound to bring trouble. Clara looked at her. He didn't bring trouble, Mrs. Harding. He brought kindness, and hope, and a reason to wake up in the morning, but I suppose that doesn't count for much around here. Mrs. Harding blinked, taken aback. Clara, if you'll excuse me, Clara said, I have work to do. She closed the door in Mrs. Harding's face and leaned against it, her chest heaving. She was tired of judgment, tired of fear, tired of people deciding what was best for her, tired of being small and poor and forgotten. Eli had seen her, really seen her. And for a little while she'd felt like someone worth knowing. Now he was gone, and all she had left were memories and the things he'd built. Days passed, then a week. Clara worked the garden, mended clothes, carried on. But at night, she would sit on the bench Eli had made and stare out at the road, half hoping, half fearing she'd see him walking back. He never came. The neighbors whispered. The valley carried on, and Clara learned to live with the ache in her chest, the space where hope used to be. On the 9th day, as she was drawing water from the well, she noticed something tucked under a stone on the porch, a piece of paper, folded carefully. Her hands trembled as she picked it up and unfolded it. Inside, in Eli's careful handwriting, I'm sorry, for everything. You reminded me what mercy looks like. I hope someday I can deserve it. Clara read it 3 times, then pressed it to her chest, her eyes burning. He'd come back. Sometime in the night, he'd come back long enough to leave this, but not long enough to stay. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket, next to the little carved bird he'd made for her. Then she went inside and closed the door. The wind picked up that evening, carrying the smell of rain. Clara stood at the window and watched the clouds roll in, dark and heavy with storm. She thought about Eli out there somewhere, walking alone. She thought about the man he used to be and the man he'd become. She thought about mercy and redemption, and all the ways people break themselves trying to outrun their past. And she made a decision. If he wouldn't come back, she would go on without him. But she would live the way he'd taught her, fixing what was broken, building what was needed, offering shelter to those who had none. She would be the mercy he'd shown her, even if he never knew. Outside, the storm broke. Rain lashed against the windows, thunder rolled across the valley, and lightning split the sky. Clara stood at the window and watched it all, the letter still in her pocket, the carved bird on the sill. And somewhere in the darkness, the road stretched on, empty, waiting, relentless. The hills swallowed him whole, and all that remained was a woman's ache and a truth that refused to die. The days after Eli left blurred together like watercolors in rain. Clara woke, worked, ate, slept, woke again. The sun rose and set, indifferent to her grief. The garden continued to grow, the plants reaching toward light, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The cabin felt too large now. The silence too loud, the empty chair by the fire a constant reminder of what she'd lost. She tried not to think about him, tried to fill her mind with work, weeding, mending, preserving what food she could for winter. But he was everywhere. In the bench he'd built, the fence he'd mended, the fishing line still set in the creek. Every corner held a ghost of him. At night she would sit by the fire and take out his letter, reading it until the words blurred. You reminded me what mercy looks like. She wanted to be angry with him, wanted to hate him for leaving, but she couldn't. Because she understood. Some people carried wounds so deep they couldn't imagine healing. Some people believed they didn't deserve peace. Eli was one of them. And nothing she said or did could change that. He had to believe it himself. 2 weeks after he left, Clara was scrubbing the floor when she heard a creak from the back corner of the cabin. She paused, listening. The sound came again, a soft groan of wood shifting. She set down her brush and walked over, kneeling by the old floorboard near the hearth. It had always been loose, one of 100 small imperfections she'd learned to live with. But now it was more than loose. It was raised slightly, as if something had been placed beneath it. Clara's heart quickened. She pried up the board carefully, the nails squeaking as they pulled free. Underneath, tucked into the space between the joists, was an oilcloth bundle. Her hands trembled as she lifted it out. It was heavier than she expected, wrapped carefully and tied with twine. She carried it to the table and set it down, staring at it for a long moment before she found the courage to open it. Inside was a leather pouch containing $50 in bills, more money than Clara had seen in 5 years. And beneath that, a letter, thick, sealed with wax. Clara broke the seal with shaking hands and unfolded the pages. The handwriting was Eli's, careful, measured, each word pressed into the paper like a prayer. Dear Clara, by the time you find this, I'll be long gone. I'm sorry I didn't have the courage to say these things to your face. I'm sorry for a lot of things. I need you to know the truth, not because it changes anything, but because you deserve to know who you sheltered, who you saved. My full name is Elias Jonathan Thorne. I was born in Boston to a family that made its fortune in shipping and railroads. My father, Richard Thorne, built an empire by the time he was 40. He was brilliant, ruthless, and utterly without conscience when it came to business. I was raised to inherit everything, educated in the finest schools, groomed to take over the company. For 20 years, I did exactly what was expected of me. I learned the business, made the deals, turned profit into more profit, and I never asked where the money came from. I never asked about the workers who died building our railroads because we cut costs on safety. Never asked about the families displaced when we bought up land for a fraction of its worth. Never asked about the bribes paid to officials, the contracts stolen from competitors, the lives crushed under the weight of our ambition. I told myself it was just business, that my father knew best, that this was how the world worked. Then 3 years ago, I met a man named Thomas Brennan. He was a union organizer, leading a strike against one of our factories. I was sent to negotiate, which really meant to threaten and bribe until they went back to work. But Thomas wouldn't be bought. He showed me the factory floor, the conditions, the children, some as young as 8, working 16-hour shifts in air so thick with dust you could barely breathe. He showed me the company housing we provided, shacks worse than the one you live in, Clara, leaking roofs, no heat, rats in the walls, and we charged them rent for the privilege. He showed me the books we kept separate from the official ledgers, the real numbers, the profit margins we could have cut to pay fair wages and still been wealthy beyond measure. This is what your family fortune is built on, Thomas said. These people, their suffering, their lives. I went home that night and looked at everything with new eyes. The mansion I lived in, the fine clothes, the parties where we drank champagne that cost more than most families earned in a month. It made me sick. I tried to change things, went to my father, showed him the numbers, argued that we could pay better, provide better conditions, and still turn a profit. He laughed at me. Sentiment is a luxury we can't afford, he said. These people are replaceable. There will always be more workers, always be more desperate hands willing to take their place. I realized then that I was complicit, that every dollar I'd inherited, every comfort I'd enjoyed, was stained with their suffering. So I made a choice. I went to Thomas and gave him everything I had. Documents, ledgers, proof of the bribes and the unsafe conditions, evidence that could bring legal action against the company. Thomas used it, filed complaints with the labor board, got newspapers involved, started a movement that spread to other factories, other industries. My father found out, of course. He tried to destroy me, publicly disowned me, had me followed, threatened, blacklisted from every business in Boston. But I didn't care. I'd already decided to leave. What I didn't know was that my uncle, my father's brother Edward, was planning something worse. 6 months after I left Boston, my father died. Suddenly. The doctors said it was his heart, but Edward made sure rumors spread that I'd poisoned him for the inheritance. It wasn't true. I'd already signed away my claim to the estate before I left. I didn't want his money, didn't want anything to do with the family. But Edward contested the will, said I'd coerced my father, that I'd stolen funds from the company, that I was a threat to the business and the family name. He made me a criminal without a trial. So I ran, not because I was guilty, but because I knew Edward would never stop. He wanted control of the company, and I was the only thing standing in his way. As long as I was alive and free, I was a threat to him. I wandered for a year, worked odd jobs, slept in barns and under bridges, tried to become someone else, someone who didn't carry the weight of that name, that history, that guilt. And then I found you, or you found me. I don't know which. Clara, you took me in when I had nothing. You fed me, sheltered me, trusted me, all without knowing who I was or what I'd done. You showed me a kindness I didn't deserve. You taught me that mercy isn't something you earn, it's something you give. You reminded me that a man can be more than his worst mistakes, that there's value in simple work, in honest labor, in fixing what's broken instead of just walking away. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was enough. Not Elias Thorne, heir to a fortune. Just Eli. A man who could plant a garden, mend a fence, carve a bird from wood, a man who could be useful, who could be good. I fell in love with you, Clara. I don't know when it happened. Maybe it was the day you brought me soup when I was too weak to stand. Maybe it was the morning you taught me how to plant by the moon. Maybe it was every small moment in between. But I did, and that's why I had to leave. Because Edward Thorne is not a man who forgives or forgets. If he discovers where I am, and he will eventually, he'll come for me, and anyone connected to me will be caught in the crossfire. I won't do that to you. You've already lived through too much loss, too much hardship. I won't be the reason you lose the little you have left. The money in this bundle is everything I had left from my old life. I want you to have it. Use it to fix the roof properly, to buy seed for next year, to keep yourself fed through the winter. I know you'll want to refuse it. I know you'll think it's charity, or pity, or payment for what you did. It's none of those things. It's a thank you. For giving me a home when I had none. For seeing me as a man worth knowing. For loving me, even if you never said the words. I saw it in your eyes, Clara. I felt it in every small kindness. You saved my life. Not just that first night in the rain, but every day after. You reminded me that life is worth living. I'm going back to Boston. Not because I want to, but because running only delays the inevitable. I'll face Edward. Face the courts. Face whatever consequences come. Maybe I'll clear my name, maybe I won't, but at least I'll do it standing up. You taught me that too. I hope you can forgive me for leaving. I hope you can understand that it wasn't because I didn't love you. It was because I did. Live well, Clara Winton. Tend your garden. Feed the hungry. Offer shelter to those who need it. Be the mercy you showed me, and if someday I find my way back, if I can ever truly be free of the past, I'll come looking for you. Until then, know that you were the best thing that ever happened to me. With all my heart, Elias. Clara read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face, blurring the ink. She could barely breathe. Her chest felt like it was being crushed, her heart breaking and mending and breaking again with every word. He loved her, he'd loved her, and he'd left to protect her. She wanted to be angry, wanted to curse him for making that choice without her, but all she felt was an aching, bone-deep sorrow. Because he was right. Edward Thorne would come. Men like that always did. And if Clara was connected to Eli when he came, she would lose everything. Not just her home, but possibly her life. Eli had chosen to face his past alone, to protect her, even if it cost him everything. Clara carefully folded the letter and placed it in the small wooden box where she kept her most precious things, her late husband's wedding ring, a pressed flower from their wedding day, a photograph of her parents. Now Eli's letter joined them. She looked at the money on the table, $50, a fortune. Her first instinct was to refuse it, to hide it away, untouched. She didn't want his money, she wanted him. But then she thought about his words. Be the mercy you showed me. Slowly, carefully, Clara made a decision. She would use the money, but not for herself. She would use it the way Eli would have wanted, to help others, to fix what was broken, to offer shelter to those who had none. She would become the mercy he'd seen in her. The next morning, Clara woke with purpose burning in her chest. She walked into town, a 3-mile journey she rarely made, and went to the general store. Mr. Patterson looked up in surprise when she entered. Mrs. Winton, he said, didn't expect to see you. I need supplies, Clara said. Flour, salt, sugar. Seeds for winter planting, lamp oil, nails. Mr. Patterson raised an eyebrow. That's quite a list. You got the money for all that? Clara pulled out $5 and set it on the counter. Will that cover it? Mr. Patterson's eyes widened. Yes, ma'am. With change to spare. Keep the change, Clara said, and I want to set up an account. For anyone who comes in needing food but can't pay. Put it against my credit. Mrs. Winton, that's what I'm doing, Clara said firmly. Can you do it or not? Mr. Patterson studied her face, then nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am, I can do that. Good, Clara said. I'll be back for more supplies next month. She left with her purchases loaded into a borrowed cart, her head high, her heart steady. The whispers followed her through town. People stared, wondered. How did poor Clara Winton suddenly have money? Where did that stranger go? What exactly had happened out at that shack? Clara didn't care. Let them talk. She had work to do over the next weeks. Clara transformed. Not in appearance. She still wore the same worn dresses, still worked the same hard labor, but in spirit. She fixed her roof properly, hiring a local carpenter to replace the worst of the boards. She expanded her garden, planting winter vegetables that would feed her through the cold months. She bought 3 chickens and a milk goat, trading eggs and milk with neighbors for what she needed. And she helped. When Mrs. Crawford's husband took ill and couldn't work, Clara brought her a basket of food, bread, eggs, preserves, and left it on her porch without a word. When the Johnsons lost their house in a fire, Clara took in their youngest daughter for 2 weeks while they rebuilt. When old Mr. Garrett died with no money for a proper burial, Clara paid for it. She didn't announce what she was doing, didn't seek recognition. She just did it, the way Eli had helped her, quietly, without expectation, because it was right. The neighbors noticed. Of course they noticed. Mrs. Harding came by one afternoon, her face pinched with curiosity. "People are talking, Clara," she said, "saying you've come into money somehow." "Let them talk," Clara replied, not looking up from the shirt she was mending. "Is it true, about the stranger, that he left you something?" Clara set down her needle and looked Mrs. Harding in the eye. "He left me a reminder." "Of what?" "That kindness matters," Clara said. "That mercy isn't earned, it's given. That we're all just one storm away from needing help ourselves." Mrs. Harding frowned. "That's all very pretty, Clara, but—" "That's all," Clara said firmly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Mrs. Harding left in a huff, but Clara didn't care. She'd spent too many years worrying about what people thought, too many years making herself small, invisible, forgettable. Eli had seen her, really seen her, and he'd believed she was capable of more than just surviving. He'd believed she could make a difference, and she would prove him right. Autumn came slowly, painting the valley in shades of gold and rust. Clara harvested her garden, more food than she'd grown in 5 years combined. She preserved what she could, shared the rest with neighbors who needed it. At night, she would sit on the bench Eli had built and watch the sun set, the carved bird on the windowsill catching the last light of day. She still thought about him, wondered where he was, whether he'd made it to Boston, whether he was safe, whether he thought of her. But the ache in her chest had changed. It was still there, would always be there, she thought, but it no longer paralyzed her. Instead, it drove her, to be better, to do more, to live the way he'd shown her, with purpose, with kindness, with quiet strength. One evening, as the first frost touched the grass, Clara found herself at the creek where Eli had fished. She stood at the water's edge, watching the current flow over the stones, remembering. The way he'd cleaned fish with quick, efficient movements. The way he'd taught her to bait a hook. The way he'd looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. "I miss you," she whispered to the water. The creek flowed on, indifferent to her grief, but Clara felt something shift inside her. Not a healing, the wound was too deep for that, but an acceptance. Eli was gone, and she would go on, not because she'd stopped loving him, but because she loved him enough to honor what he'd given her. A purpose, a strength, a belief that she mattered. She turned and walked back toward the cabin, her shawl wrapped tight against the cold. Behind her, the last light faded from the hills, and ahead, the cabin glowed warm with lamplight, small, simple, but filled now with something more than loneliness, filled with hope. Winter approached. The valley prepared to sleep, and Clara Winton, once forgotten and invisible, became someone people looked to, the widow who'd helped a stranger and learned to help herself, the woman who'd lost love and found purpose, the mercy that refused to die, and just as the land began to forgive the storm, so too did her heart learn to wait without hope, but with faith. Winter came hard that year. The first snow fell in early November, blanketing the valley in white silence. Clara woke to a world transformed, the garden buried, the road erased, the hills distant and ghostly through the falling flakes. She stood at the window, wrapped in a quilt, watching the snow accumulate on the bench Eli had built. Already it was covered, the wood disappearing beneath the weight of winter. Everything he'd touched was still here. The fence, the roof, the careful rows of the garden now sleeping beneath the snow, but the man himself was gone. And Clara had learned to live with that absence the way you learn to live with a scar. It never truly heals, but eventually you stop noticing it every moment of every day. She'd been alone before, she could be alone again. But God, some mornings it still hurt. The winter months passed in a rhythm of survival. Clara chopped wood, hauled water, tended the animals. She rationed her supplies carefully, making the money Eli left stretch as far as it would go. And she continued helping others. quietly, persistently, becoming known throughout the valley as someone you could turn to when you had nowhere else to go. People stopped whispering about the stranger, started talking instead about Clara herself, about her generosity, her strength, the way she'd pulled herself up from poverty and somehow managed to lift others along the way. She never told them about Eli's letter, never explained where the money came from or what he'd meant to her. That was private, sacred, hers alone. February brought a brief thaw, the snow melting into mud, the roads turning to rivers of brown slush. Clara was in the barn checking on the goat when she heard the sound of wheels on the road. She stepped outside, shading her eyes against the weak winter sun. A carriage was approaching, not a wagon or a farm cart, but an actual carriage, black, polished, drawn by two fine horses, the kind of vehicle that had no business on a muddy country road in the middle of nowhere. Clara's stomach tightened. She wiped her hands on her apron and waited. The carriage stopped in front of her cabin. The driver, an older man in a pressed coat, climbed down and opened the door. A figure emerged, stepping carefully into the mud. A man, tall, thin, dressed in a dark suit that looked expensive even from a distance. He carried a leather case under one arm and moved with the careful precision of someone used to city streets, not country mud. He picked his way toward Clara, wincing each time his shoes sank into the muck. "Mrs. Clara Winton?" he called. "That's me," Clara said, not moving from the porch. The man reached the steps and looked up at her. He was perhaps 50, with graying hair and wire-rimmed spectacles. His face was kind but tired, the face of a man who'd traveled a long way and wasn't happy about it. "My name is Albert Whitmore," he said. "I'm an attorney from Boston. May I come in?" Clara's heart hammered in her chest. "Boston. Attorney. Eli. What's this about?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "It's a matter of some delicacy," Whitmore said. "I'd prefer to discuss it inside, if you don't mind." Clara hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in, then." Whitmore entered the cabin, removing his hat and glancing around with the quick, assessing look of someone cataloging details. He took in the bare walls, the simple furniture, the mended clothes hanging by the fire. His expression didn't change, but Clara felt judged nonetheless. "Please, sit," she said, gesturing to the table. Whitmore sat carefully, setting his case on the table. Clara remained standing, her arms crossed. "Would you like coffee?" she asked, more out of habit than hospitality. "No, thank you." Whitmore opened his case and withdrew a sheaf of papers. "Mrs. Winton, I'll be direct. I'm here regarding the estate of Elias Jonathan Thorne." Clara's breath caught. "Is he deceased?" "Yes," Whitmore said quietly. "I'm very sorry." The room tilted. Clara grabbed the back of the chair to steady herself, her knuckles white. "When?" she whispered. 3 months ago. December 18th. 3 months. He'd been dead for 3 months, and she hadn't known, hadn't felt it, hadn't even sensed that the world had lost him. "How?" Clara asked, her voice breaking. Whitmore's expression softened. "He took ill on the journey to Boston. Pneumonia, the doctor said. He made it to the city, but he was already quite weak. He passed within a week of arriving." Clara sank into the chair opposite him, her legs giving out. Pneumonia. The cold, the long walk. He'd left here healthy, or healthy enough, and he'd died alone in a city that had never wanted him. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice hollow. Whitmore adjusted his spectacles. "Because Mr. Thorne left explicit instructions regarding his estate. Instructions that concern you." Clara looked up sharply. "Me? Yes, ma'am." Whitmore pulled out a document, unfolding it carefully. "This is Mr. Thorne's last will and testament, properly witnessed and notarized. Would you like me to read the relevant sections?" Clara couldn't speak. She just nodded. Whitmore cleared his throat and began to read. "I, Elias Jonathan Thorne, being of sound mind and body, do hereby make this my last will and testament. First, I acknowledge that I previously renounced all claim to my father's estate and the holdings of Thorne Industries. That renunciation stands. I want no part of that legacy. However, in the years since my father's death, certain investments made in my name, unknown to me and separate from the company, have matured. These investments, totaling approximately $240,000, are legally mine, free from any claim by my uncle or the company. It is the distribution of these funds that I address here. To my uncle, Edward Thorne, I leave nothing. He has taken enough from this family and will get nothing more from me. To the workers of Thorn Industries and their families, I leave $50,000 to be distributed through the Labor Relief Fund established by Thomas Brennan. Let it begin to repay what was taken from them. To Thomas Brennan himself, I leave $10,000 with my gratitude for his integrity and his friendship. He showed me what courage looks like. The remainder of my estate, $180,000 plus the property listed below, I leave entirely and without condition to Mrs. Clara Winton of the Western Territories. Whitmore paused. Clara stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. There's more, Whitmore said gently. He continued reading. Clara Winton took me in when I had nothing. She fed me, sheltered me, and showed me a kindness I did not deserve and could never repay. She asked nothing in return, expected nothing. She simply saw a man in need and helped him. In doing so, she saved my life. Not just physically, but in every way that matters. She reminded me that goodness exists, that mercy is real, that a life can have purpose beyond profit and power. She taught me what it means to be human. I leave her everything I have not because she needs it, though I hope it makes her life easier, but because I cannot imagine anyone more deserving. She will use it wisely. She will use it to help others, as she helped me. Clara, if you are hearing this, I am sorry I could not return to you. I am sorry I died before I could clear my name, before I could come back and tell you in person what you meant to me. I loved you. I love you still, wherever I am now. You were the best thing that ever happened to me. Build something beautiful with this inheritance. Not for me, but for yourself. For the people in that valley who need what you have to give. Be the mercy you showed me. And know that every good thing I did, every moment of peace I found, every hope I carried, all of it came from you. Thank you. For everything. Elias's. Whitmore finished reading and set the document down. The cabin was silent except for the crackle of the fire. Clara sat frozen, tears streaming down her face, her hand pressed to her mouth. $180,000. It was impossible, unthinkable, more money than she could imagine in 10 lifetimes. There's also a property, Whitmore said quietly, a small estate in New Hampshire that belonged to Mr. Thorne's mother. It's been held in trust for years, but it now passes to you as well. If you wish to sell it, I can arrange that. Clara couldn't speak, couldn't think. Eli was dead, and he'd left her everything. She swallowed hard. I don't understand. Why me? Because he loved you, Whitmore said simply. The letter makes that clear, but I'm nobody, Clara whispered. I was just someone who opened a door. Mrs. Winton, Whitmore said gently. Sometimes that's everything. Clara stood abruptly and walked to the window. Outside, the snow was melting, dripping from the eaves, turning the world into a mess of mud and slush. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and closed her eyes. He was gone, really, truly gone. Not out there somewhere, walking roads she'd never see. Not in Boston fighting legal battles, not anywhere she could imagine finding him. Just gone. And he'd left her a fortune. Mrs. Winton? Whitmore's voice was soft behind her. I know this is overwhelming, but there are decisions to be made, papers to sign. The estate must be settled. I don't want it, Clara said, her voice hollow. Whitmore was quiet for a moment. Ma'am, with respect, that's not really an option. The will is legal and binding. The money is yours. I don't want his money, Clara said, turning to face him. I wanted him. Her voice broke on the last word, and she pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to hold back the sobs. But they came anyway, tearing out of her chest, raw and ugly and unstoppable. Whitmore stood and took a step back, giving her space. He didn't try to comfort her or tell her it would be all right. He just waited, patient and quiet, while she fell apart. After a long time, Clara's sobs faded to silence. She wiped her face with her apron and took a shaky breath. I'm sorry, she said. Don't be, Whitmore replied. Grief isn't something to apologize for. Clara walked back to the table and sat down. She felt empty, hollowed out, like something essential had been carved away, leaving only a shell. What do I have to do, she asked. Whitmore pulled out more papers. Sign these documents. They transfer ownership of the funds and property to you. I've arranged for the money to be held in a bank in the nearest city. I believe that's about 40 miles from here. You'll have access to it whenever you need. Clara nodded numbly. Whitmore handed her a pen, and she signed where he indicated. Again and again, her hand moving automatically while her mind drifted somewhere else. When it was done, Whitmore gathered the papers and returned them to his case. "There's one more thing," he said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Mr. Thorne left this for you personally. He asked that it be delivered into your hands." He set it on the table. Clara stared at it for a long moment before reaching out with trembling fingers. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small wooden box, cedar, beautifully made, with her initials carved into the lid. She opened it. Inside were three things: a pressed wildflower, one of the yellow ones that grew by the creek, a piece of paper with a single sentence in Eli's handwriting, "You were my home," and a ring, simple gold, slightly worn, with a tiny inscription inside, "C, always. E." Clara lifted the ring with shaking hands and slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. She closed her fist around it and pressed it to her chest, bending forward, a new wave of grief crashing over her. Whitmore stood quietly. "I'll leave you now, Mrs. Winton. If you have questions about the estate, about anything, here's my card. You can reach me in Boston." He set the card on the table and moved toward the door. "Mr. Whitmore," Clara said, her voice raw. He stopped, looked back. Did he? Was he alone when he died? Whitmore's expression softened. "No, ma'am. Thomas Brennan was with him. He said Mr. Thorne's last words were about you, about a woman in the West who'd shown him kindness," he said. Whitmore paused. "He said he hoped you'd understand." Clara closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Thank you." Whitmore nodded and left, closing the door softly behind him. Clara sat alone in the cabin, the ring on her finger, the wooden box in her lap. Outside, the carriage pulled away, wheels splashing through the mud, carrying Mr. Whitmore back to whatever world he'd come from, and Clara was left with silence, and a fortune, and a grief so vast she didn't know how to contain it. For a long time she just sat there, staring at nothing. The fire burned low, the light faded, the cabin grew cold. Finally, as darkness settled over the valley, Clara stood. She walked to the window and looked out at the bench, the garden, the fence, all the things Eli had built, all the pieces of himself he'd left behind. "I understand," she whispered to the darkness. "I understand." He'd loved her, truly loved her, enough to give her everything, enough to trust her with his legacy, enough to believe she would use it well, and she would, not because she wanted his money, not because she needed his wealth, but because she loved him too. And this was all she had left of him, his hope, his belief, his final act of mercy. She would not waste it. Clara turned from the window and looked around the cabin, at the small space that had held so much, at the life she'd built from nothing. Tomorrow she would begin. She would use Eli's inheritance the way he'd used his last months, to fix what was broken, to build what was needed, to offer shelter to those who had none. She would become the mercy he'd seen in her, for him, for herself, for everyone who would come after. But tonight she would grieve. She pulled on her shawl and stepped outside into the cold. The snow crunched beneath her feet as she walked to the bench. She brushed the snow away and sat down, pulling her shawl tight. Above, the stars were beginning to emerge, bright and cold against the black sky. Clara looked up at them and whispered into the night, "I love you, Eli. I love you and I miss you and I wish you were here." The wind answered, cold and sharp. But somewhere in that wind, Clara thought she felt something else, a presence, a warmth, a promise. You were my home, and he would always be hers. Inside the cabin, the fire flickered. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, and in the valley below, in a small shack with a mended roof and a garden waiting for spring, a woman sat alone with her grief, and her hope, and her future. Yet even as wealth returned, she knew her truest inheritance was mercy itself. 5 years later, the spring morning arrived soft and golden, the kind of light that makes everything look like a promise kept. Clara stood on the porch of the house, not the old shack, but the new house, built with care and strong timber on the same piece of land, and watched the valley wake up. The garden had grown. What had once been a few scraggly rows now stretched across an acre, bursting with vegetables, herbs, and flowers. Beyond it, the orchard she'd planted 3 years ago was beginning to bear fruit. Apple trees, their blossoms pink and white against the morning sky. But it wasn't just her land that had changed. Down the road, past the creek, she could see the rooftops of 3 new homes, simple structures, sturdy and warm, built for families who'd had nowhere else to go, The Johnsons, who'd lost everything in that fire. The Brennan family, newly arrived from the east with nothing but hope and calloused hands. Old Mrs. Whitfield, whose sons had died in the war, leaving her alone until Clara had offered her a place. And beyond those homes, visible through the morning mist, was the schoolhouse. It had taken 2 years to build, a small whitewashed building with a bell tower and windows that caught the morning light. Clara had funded it entirely, hired a teacher from back east, and made sure every child in the valley could attend, regardless of whether their parents could pay. The bell rang now, clear and bright across the valley. Clara smiled. Eli would have loved this. She walked down the porch steps, her skirt brushing against the railings Eli had built so long ago. She'd kept the old bench, restored and repainted, sitting in a place of honor by the front door. Some mornings she still sat there and imagined him beside her, watching the sunrise. The ring he'd left her never left her finger. She touched it now, a habit she'd developed over the years, a small gesture of remembrance, a way of saying I haven't forgotten, she would never forget. Mrs. Clara. The voice was young, bright with excitement. Clara turned to see a boy running up the path. Samuel, 8 years old, with dirt on his knees and a gap-toothed grin. He'd been orphaned 2 years ago when fever took his parents. Clara had taken him in without hesitation. He was hers now, in every way that mattered. Samuel, Clara said, trying to sound stern but failing. You're supposed to be at school. I know, but I had to show you. He held up a carved wooden horse, rough but recognizable. I made it. Mr. Brennan taught me how to use the knife properly, and I didn't cut myself once. Clara took the horse, turning it over in her hands. The proportions were off, the legs uneven, but it was clear what it was meant to be. She felt a sudden tightness in her chest. Eli had carved too, had taught her with patient hands how to see the shape hiding inside the wood. Now Samuel was learning. The cycle continued. It's beautiful, Clara said, handing it back. You're getting better. Can I make more? Mr. Brennan said he'd teach me to make birds next. After your schoolwork, Clara said firmly. Education first, carving second. Samuel groaned but nodded. Yes, ma'am. He ran back toward the schoolhouse, the wooden horse clutched in his hand. Clara watched him go, her heart full. This was what Eli had given her. Not just money, not just security, but the ability to give others what had been given to her. A home, a chance, a future. Clara walked toward the barn, where she kept 2 cows, a handful of chickens, and the old goat that had been with her since those early days. As she approached, she saw a figure already there, a young woman, maybe 20, with auburn hair tied back and sleeves rolled up. Morning, Mrs. Clara, the woman said, not looking up from the milking. Morning, Beth, Clara replied. How's the cow? Giving good milk? Better than yesterday. Beth finished and stood, wiping her hands on her apron. You want me to take it to the Crawfords? I heard Mrs. Crawford's feeling poorly again. Please, Clara said, and take some eggs, too. And that loaf of bread I baked yesterday. Beth nodded and went to gather the items. She was one of the first people Clara had hired after receiving the inheritance, a girl from town whose father drank away his wages and left his family to starve. Clara had given her work, then a place to stay, then a future. Now Beth managed much of the farm, freeing Clara to focus on the larger projects, the school, the homes, the well she was planning to dig on the south edge of the valley where water was scarce. Clara didn't do the work alone anymore. She'd learned that mercy multiplied when it was shared, that one person's kindness could spark a dozen others, that the greatest inheritance wasn't money, but the example of how to use it. By mid-morning, Clara was in the kitchen of the main house, not her house, but the community house she'd built 3 years ago. It was larger than any home in the valley, with a dining hall that could seat 40 people, a kitchen designed for cooking in quantity, and rooms upstairs for travelers or families in crisis. Every Sunday, Clara opened the doors for a communal meal. Anyone could come. No one was turned away. Today was Wednesday, but she was preparing food anyway. A family had arrived late last night, exhausted and hungry, fleeing drought and failed crops 200 miles south. Clara had given them a room, promised them work, and was now making enough stew to fill their bellies. As she worked, she heard footsteps on the stairs. A moment later, a young woman appeared, thin, worn, with a baby on her hip, and exhaustion carved into every line of her face. Mrs. Winton, the woman said hesitantly. I wanted to thank you for taking us in. We didn't have anywhere else to go. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and smiled. You're welcome here as long as you need. We can work, the woman said quickly. My husband's strong, and I can cook, clean, mend, whatever you need. I'm sure we can find something, Clara said. But first you need to rest. You've traveled a long way. The woman's eyes filled with tears. I don't know how to thank you. Clara stepped forward and took the woman's hand. You don't have to. Just, when you're back on your feet, and you see someone else who needs help, help them. That's thanks enough. The woman nodded, tears spilling over. Clara squeezed her hand once, then released it. Now sit, eat. You're safe here. The day unfolded in its familiar rhythm. Clara checked on the families in the new homes, delivered supplies to the school, met with the carpenter about the well project. Everywhere she went, people greeted her, not with the pity they'd once shown poor Clara Winton, but with respect, gratitude, even love. She'd become the heart of the valley, the person people turned to in crisis, the woman who'd taken one man's mercy and turned it into a legacy. But Clara never forgot where it came from, never forgot the man who'd collapsed at her door in the rain, the man who'd taught her that kindness wasn't weakness, that generosity wasn't foolishness, that one person's act of mercy could change everything. That evening, as the sun began its slow descent, Clara walked to the place she visited every week without fail. The cemetery sat on a hill overlooking the valley, shaded by oak trees and bordered by a white fence she'd built herself. Most of the graves were old, pioneers and settlers from generations past, but near the back, beneath a young maple tree, was a stone that Clara had commissioned from a mason in the city. It was simple, clean. The words carved deep: Elias Jonathan Thorne, 1841 to 1876. Beloved, you were my home. Eli wasn't buried here. His body lay in Boston, in the family plot he'd wanted no part of. But Clara had placed this stone anyway, a memorial, a marker, a way of keeping him close. She knelt beside it now, brushing away the dried leaves, straightening the wildflowers she'd brought the week before. I finished the well project, she said quietly, as if he could hear. We broke ground last week, should have water flowing by summer. The Hendersons are moving into one of the new houses next month, and Samuel's learning to carve. You'd like him, Eli. He reminds me of you, quiet but kind. She paused, tracing the letters of his name with one finger. I wish you could see it, she whispered. Everything you made possible, all the lives you've changed, people you never met, who'll never know your name, but who are alive and safe and fed because of you. The wind stirred the leaves overhead. A bird called from somewhere in the branches. I still miss you, Clara said, her voice breaking. Every day, I see something, a sunrise, a child laughing, a fence that needs mending, and I think, I have to tell Eli about this, and then I remember. She closed her eyes. I remember you're gone. A tear slipped down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. But I'm keeping my promise, she continued. I'm being the mercy you saw in me. I'm building something beautiful, something that'll last long after I'm gone. She opened her eyes and looked out over the valley, at the homes, the school, the fields green with spring growth, at the life that had bloomed from one act of kindness in a rainstorm. Thank you, Clara whispered, for everything, for seeing me, for loving me, for trusting me with this. She stood, brushing the dirt from her skirt. She kissed her fingers and pressed them to the stone, a ritual she'd performed 100 times. Then she turned and walked back down the hill, toward the house, toward Samuel and Beth and the family sheltering in the community house, toward the life she'd built, the life Eli had made possible. That night, after supper was finished and the dishes washed, Clara sat on the old bench with Samuel beside her. The boy was carving another piece of wood, his tongue sticking out in concentration. Mrs. Clara? He said after a while. Yes? Why do you help people? Clara thought about the question. She could give him a simple answer, because it's right or because they need it, but Samuel deserved better. A long time ago, she said slowly, I was alone, poor. I had nothing but this old shack in a garden that barely grew. And then one night, in the middle of a terrible storm, a man collapsed at my door. Samuel looked up, interested now. He was dying, Clara continued, cold, hurt, starving. I could have turned him away. Could have told myself I didn't have enough to share, but I didn't. I brought him in, fed him, took care of him. The man in the graveyard, Samuel asked. Mr. Thorne? Clara nodded. Yes, Eli. He stayed with me for a while, helped me fix things, taught me things. And when he left," she paused, swallowing against the tightness in her throat. "He left me everything he had, not because he wanted to pay me back, but because he wanted me to help others the way I'd helped him." "So you do," Samuel said. "So I do," Clara agreed. "Because mercy isn't something you hoard, Samuel. It's something you pass on. Like a flame, you don't lose light by lighting another candle." Samuel thought about this, then nodded solemnly. "I want to help people too. When I grow up," Clara smiled and ruffled his hair. "You already are. Every time you're kind, every time you share, every time you see someone who needs help and you don't look away." She tapped his chest lightly. "That's where it starts. Right here." Samuel looked down at the wooden horse in his hands. Then he held it out to Clara. "You can have this," he said. "Since you gave me a home." Clara's eyes stung with tears. She took the horse carefully, cradling it in her palm. "Thank you, Samuel," she said softly. "I'll treasure it." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one over the valley, and Clara felt, for the first time in years, something close to peace. Not the absence of grief, she would carry that forever, but the presence of purpose, of love, of legacy. The years continued to pass. Clara grew older, her hair turning silver, her hands growing stiff with age. But her spirit never weakened. She continued to build, to give, to shelter. The valley prospered, more families came, more homes were built. The school expanded, a church was erected, a doctor settled in the area, drawn by Clara's reputation for caring for those in need. People came from miles away to meet the woman who'd turned a widow's shack into a haven, who'd taken one man's inheritance and multiplied it into 100 blessings. They called her a saint, a benefactor, a miracle. But Clara always corrected them. "I'm just a woman who was shown kindness once," she'd say, "and I'm trying to pass it on." On her 65th birthday, the valley threw a celebration. Every family she'd helped came, dozens of people, filling the community house to bursting. There was food, music, laughter. Children ran through the halls. Old friends embraced. Samuel, now a grown man with a family of his own, stood to make a speech. "Mrs. Clara saved my life," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just by taking me in, but by showing me what it means to live for something bigger than yourself. She taught me that mercy is the most powerful force in the world, that one person's kindness can change everything." He raised his glass. "To Mrs. Clara Winton, the best of us." "To Mrs. Clara," the crowd echoed. Clara stood, tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the love in the room. She looked around at all the faces, people she'd fed, housed, helped, loved, people who'd become family. "Thank you," she said simply. "All of you. For letting me be part of your lives. For giving me purpose. For," her voice broke, "for being my home." She sat down to thunderous applause, and the celebration continued around her. But Clara's mind drifted elsewhere, to a rain-soaked night, to a dying man at her door, to a love that had burned bright and brief and left her forever changed. "Thank you, Eli," she thought, "for all of it." Years later, Clara couldn't say exactly how many. Time had become fluid in her old age. She felt the end approaching. She was tired, bone-tired, the kind of tired that sleep couldn't fix. She spent her final days in the small bedroom of the house she'd built, surrounded by the people she loved, Samuel and his children, Beth, still by her side after all these years, the families she'd helped, coming to sit with her, to hold her hand, to tell her what she'd meant to them. On the last morning, as dawn broke over the valley, Clara woke to find herself alone. She rose slowly, carefully, and walked to the window. Outside, the world was washed in gold. The garden stretched toward the horizon. The schoolhouse bell gleamed in the morning light. Smoke rose from chimneys in the houses scattered across the valley. It was beautiful. She'd built something beautiful. Clara turned from the window and saw him. Eli stood by the door, wearing the same torn coat from that first night, but whole now, healed. His eyes were clear, his face peaceful. He smiled. "Clara," he said softly. She didn't question it, didn't wonder if she was dreaming or dying or somewhere in between. She just moved toward him, and he opened his arms. She stepped into his embrace, and for the first time in decades, she felt complete. "I've been waiting," Eli murmured against her hair. "I've been waiting for you. I'm here now." Clara whispered. I know. He pulled back slightly, looking into her eyes. You did it, Clara. Everything I hoped you would. Everything I knew you could. I tried, Clara said. I tried to be the mercy you saw in me. You were, Eli said. You are. You always will be. He took her hand, the one wearing his ring, and kissed her knuckles gently. Come on, he said. Let me show you home. And together they walked toward the light. They found Clara that morning, sitting in the chair by the window, her face peaceful, a slight smile on her lips. In her lap was the wooden box Eli had left her, open, the pressed flower and the note visible. You were my home. Samuel wept. Beth wept. The whole valley wept. But they also celebrated. Because Clara Winton had lived a life worth celebrating, a life of mercy, of kindness, of quiet strength that had changed everything it touched. They buried her on the hill, beside Eli's memorial stone, beneath the maple tree that had grown tall and strong over the years. The entire valley came to the funeral. People told stories about the time Clara had taken in a family of 7 with no notice, the time she'd paid for a stranger's medicine, the time she'd given away her last loaf of bread and gone hungry herself. Story after story, each one a testament to a life well lived. And when the last words were spoken, and the last flowers laid, Samuel placed a small wooden bird on her grave, carved from cedar, wings spread in flight. Thank you, he whispered, for everything. The valley continued. The school remained open, the families stayed, the well Clara had built kept flowing, and every year, on the anniversary of her death, the people she'd helped would gather on the hill and tell the story. The story of a poor woman who'd helped a silent traveler. The story of a man who'd left her everything. The story of mercy multiplied. The story of the house that kindness built. Decades later, when Samuel was an old man himself, he would sit his grandchildren down and tell them about Clara Winton. She was just an ordinary woman, he'd say. Poor, forgotten, nobody special. Until one night she opened her door to a stranger in the rain. And then what happened? The children would ask. Then everything changed, Samuel would say, because mercy isn't about money or power or fame. It's about seeing someone who needs help and helping them. That's all. That's everything. Did they live happily ever after? A child would ask. Samuel would pause, thinking about Clara's life, the grief, the loss, the years of loneliness before the end. No, he'd say honestly. But they lived well. They lived with purpose. They loved deeply and lost deeply and kept going anyway. And in the end, they built something that lasted. He'd gesture out the window, toward the valley still thriving, still growing. They built this. They built hope. Is that better than happily ever after? Another child would ask. And Samuel would smile, remembering Clara's words from so long ago. Yes, he'd say. I think it is. The sun set over the valley, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. The schoolhouse bell rang one final time, calling the children home. Smoke rose from chimneys, lamps were lit in windows, and on the hill beneath the maple tree, 2 stones stood side by side. Elias, Jonathan Thorne, you were my home. Clara Winton, 1843 to 1908. Beloved by all, she was the mercy we all needed. The wind stirred the leaves. A bird sang its evening song, and the valley, built on kindness, built on love, built on one woman's choice to open her door, carried on. And as dusk painted the valley in gold, the story of one small kindness became legend.